The clan's history was forged by untouchable legends, warriors who defined the peak of strength and shaped the world. It was a legacy marked by an insatiable bloodlust and an ambition that often bordered on madness. For them, the only thing that mattered was absolute supremacy, leaving only loneliness at the top for the victor. Within that brutal hierarchy, the weak had no voice. Their existence served only to be controlled by the strongest. The Runcandle family mansion didn't function as a welcoming home, but rather as a cold and ruthless arena. The protagonist was born under the crushing shadow of countless ancestors and prodigious siblings, bearing the weight of a legendary surname. From the cradle, his destiny was decided by the blade. The baby was expected to seek the sword before even learning to walk. Before the patriarch's overwhelming presence, the boy felt insignificant, suffocated by the demand for a power he didn't possess. Jin naively believed, for a brief moment, that his future would be naturally bright, filled with fame and glory. However, this sweet illusion shattered violently against the harsh reality of his condition. No matter how much the young man strained himself to exhaustion, the truth was cruel. He didn't possess a shred of talent for the sword. He became the living shame of the family. The labels of disgrace and failure weighed on his shoulders as he trained in isolation. But not even in his isolation did the boy find peace. A sudden noise and a call interrupted his solitary practice. Jin turned slowly, recognizing that presence and anticipating the usual contempt that would follow. The cruel smile plastered on his brother's face confirmed that another session of mockery and humiliation was about to begin. The older brother smiled with disdain, clearly savoring the opportunity to torment the family's shame. Jin felt the weight of that hostile presence, unable to hide the nervousness that took over his body. The young man held his wooden sword, aware that the difference in power between them made any defense useless. Irritated by the younger brother's silence, the aggressor demanded an immediate response, resorting to physical violence without warning. The blow struck Jin with brutality, punishing him for his supposed insolence before a superior. The impact was enough to knock him down, leaving him breathless and struggling to stay conscious on the cold ground. Vulnerable, the protagonist looked up, finding only the arrogant gaze of someone who knew himself untouchable. Driven by the instinct for survival, he tried to reach his fallen weapon, refusing to give up completely. However, before his fingers closed on the hilt, a heavy boot crushed his hand, blocking the action. Jin gritted his teeth tightly, suppressing a cry of pain as his attempt at resistance was thwarted. The brother then pulled out a stack of papers, revealing that the physical torture was just the prelude to something worse. He waved the documents in the air with an air of triumph, amusing himself with the younger brother's impending doom. The amusement soon gave way to pure malice, as he prepared to destroy what little Jin had left. Ignoring the young man's desperate cry to stop, the man grabbed the training sword with both hands. The wood cracked and broke in half, symbolizing the fragility of Jin's hopes within that ruthless clan. Jin's hope shattered at that instant. Terror paralyzed his movements before the imminent threat. His efforts were trampled without any mercy. Everything the young man built with so much sweat was destroyed in seconds. The brother subdued him with brutal violence, grabbing him to impose his physical and psychological dominance. There was no escape. As Jin struggled in vain to break free, his tormentor justified the cruelty as a twisted favor. The humiliation was absolute. The protagonist stared at the imposing figure, painfully realizing that the distance of power between them was insurmountable. He always envied the natural talent that his siblings possessed. That innate strength seemed like an unattainable dream for him. Jin naively believed that hard work would be enough to compensate for his lack of talent. He clung desperately to this conviction. The boy convinced himself that persistence would eventually bring recognition from his family. But he was wrong. The final sentence was delivered, sealing his fate irrevocably. Jin Runcandle was officially banished from his home and his lineage. The clan's symbol, once a source of pride, now represented only total rejection. The doors of glory closed for him. The exiled one stood before the colossal entrance, stripped of his title, his heritage, and his future. Frustration burned in his veins. He suppressed his impotent rage, unable to change the injustice of that verdict. A cruel smile marked the farewell. There was no compassion for the family failure, only a cold, calculated contempt. Without direction or purpose, the former noble began his solitary walk, left to his own devices in a ruthless world. He became just another forgotten face in the crowd, hiding his identity and shame under the cloak of anonymity. The memory of a luminous and unattainable power still visited his thoughts. It wasn't just physical strength, but an energy he could never control. He recalled how easily magic flowed for the talented, a bitter contrast to his own failure. Back in the monotonous reality of his exile, Jin noticed a sudden change in the atmosphere around him. A sinister presence rose from the ground, paralyzing him with an instinctive fear. The young man recoiled in panic, surprised by the supernatural manifestation invading his refuge. There was nowhere to run. Darkness took over everything, enveloping him completely. Jin tried to stay conscious, facing the abyss that was forming before him. From the depths, a colossal entity revealed itself, declaring its sovereignty over the shadows. The ancient being recognized the boy's lineage, addressing him as a true run candle. The exiled one stood still, feeling insignificant before the magnitude of that divinity. The entity leaned in, examining the human soul with peculiar interest. Suddenly, mystical chains became visible, exposing the secret that had bound him since birth. The god of shadows questioned the nature of that barrier, realizing something that Jin himself didn't know. The seal shone brightly, revealing that the young man's lack of talent was, in fact, an imposed curse. With a violent snap, the mystical chains that bound his potential finally gave way and dissolved into the air. The entity ensured that this restriction would never torment him again. Jin felt the weight of years of failure dissipate, realizing that he was finally free. As the divine presence began to retreat into the shadows, the young Runcandle watched silently, processing the sudden change in his destiny. He remained still for a moment after the god's departure. The promise that he would continue to be watched echoed in his mind. But now he had a chance. There was no time to waste on doubts or reflections. Jin gripped the hilt of his sword, needing to test his new condition immediately. The protagonist ran to the outer courtyard, eager to put his body to the test and discover the extent of his freedom. His fingers closed firmly around the grip. The weapon felt like a natural extension of his arm now, without the crushing weight from before. With a fluid movement, he cut through the air, seeking the invisible resistance that had always hindered his movements in the past. The blade obeyed perfectly, vibrating with a stability and strength that he had never been able to achieve during his years of training. The realization hit him hard. A smile of pure satisfaction and confidence appeared as he realized that the curse was truly gone. The young man continued to move, attacking the void, feeling a lightness and speed that were foreign to him until that moment. Each strike was precise and vigorous. The joy of finally having absolute control over his own body was intoxicating. However, swordsmanship was just the beginning. Jin decided to summon his mana, testing whether magic would also flow freely along with his movements. The energy responded to his call instantly, running through the steel and enveloping the blade in an aura of concentrated power. There was the true potential that had been denied to him. Jin now wielded the perfect combination of steel and magic, ready to rewrite his story. Jin felt the power flow through his veins. All the effort of that cursed life was finally bearing tangible fruit. However, his memory suddenly betrayed him, dragging him back to the dark forest of that fateful night. Armored knights surrounded him. The young man knew that there was no escape against those silent opponents. The fatal blow came quickly and mercilessly. The sharp pain marked the exact moment when his previous life was taken. In his last moments of lucidity, Jin's hand trembled, desperately trying to grab something in the void. He fell defeated among the rubble, not understanding why fate had been so cruel to him until the end. Blood streamed from his mouth, taking with it the consciousness and last hopes of the Runcandle. His assassins left without looking back, leaving the failed body to rot in the ruins. Death embraced him completely. Silence took over everything, signaling the end of his journey. But fate intervened. An ancient book lay mysteriously beside his forgotten corpse. The darkness of the place was then disturbed, as if time and space were being rewritten. Suddenly, consciousness returned. The boy woke with a start, confused as to why he still existed. The vivid image of his own shattered body bathed in blood still haunted his mind. However, upon examining himself, the shock was immediate. Those hands were too small to be an adult's. Jin raised his head and froze. Imposing figures from his past stood before him, alive again. The garden was full of blades stuck in the ground, awaiting the decisive moment of the selection ceremony. A maternal figure watched the scene with affection, silently encouraging the little one to make his choice. Among so many common weapons, something unique immediately caught the protagonist's attention and awakened his memories. He recognized the blade instantly. It was Banished, the legendary inheritance and ultimate symbol of the clan. Jin could hardly believe the opportunity that fate was offering him so early in his new life. The sword seemed to call to him, standing out like an imposing beacon among the other irrelevant options. The baby stood firm on the ground, moved by a will that did not match his tender age. Although his body was fragile and clumsy, he advanced stubbornly across the lawn towards his goal. Jin ignored everything around him and reached out to the object that would define his future as a Runkandel. The clan members watched the scene, at first just amused by the child's curious movements. However, the young man knew exactly what he was doing. He vowed that, this time, his path would be different. He approached the golden blade with the absolute conviction of someone claiming what is rightfully theirs. The patriarch, however, noticed the intensity in his son's eyes, and his expression changed to pure astonishment. The atmosphere in the garden suddenly changed, and the spectators felt the weight of that decision. The family leader narrowed his eyes, witnessing the birth of a potential he never expected to see. The memory of the legendary sword Banished and the weight of that choice still echoed in Jin's mind. However, he knew that absolute power was still far from the reach of his childish hands. Time passed, and the young Runkandel was sent to live in isolation in the imposing Storm Castle. His child's body, however, imposed frustrating physical limitations on his daily ambitions. Jin realized that, however mature his mind was, his stature prevented him from achieving what he wanted. But he wasn't the type to be defeated by obstacles as simple as height. With a little improvisation, the protagonist overcame the physical barrier that separated him from knowledge. He immersed himself in reading, absorbing vital information to ensure his future survival. Suddenly, his concentration on his studies was broken by a restless presence behind him. The nanny entered the room, but her expression instantly changed from zeal to pure horror. With a trembling voice, the woman warned the young master about something grotesque she had found. A dead animal had been left there, as a bloody warning, a cruel and macabre prank. Jin, however, showed no fear. He simply observed the scene with a calculating and adult coldness. The servant turned to the hallway, immediately realizing who the real culprits were. Jin's brothers watched from the shadows, amused by the sadistic attempt to traumatize a child. Jin clearly recalled the exact moment he was found in that past life. The memory surfaced vividly in his mind. The young Runkandel didn't feel fear, but rather amused contempt for his brother's arrogant stance. He simply awaited their next move. His mind briefly wandered to the dark memories of his previous existence. Back then, isolation and silence were his only companions. He knew exactly who they were. In the future, those two would become notorious assassins who hunted him without any mercy. Their cruelty started early. Killing an innocent creature was just a sadistic warning to try and intimidate him. Surrounded by imminent threats, the protagonist remained still. He refused to show the weakness or dread they expected from him. The brothers smiled maliciously, believing they had absolute control of the situation. They eagerly awaited Jin's emotional collapse. However, silence remained. Jin clenched his jaw and didn't give them the satisfaction of a trembling response. The lack of reaction irritated the aggressor. He mocked openly, leaning in and pretending not to hear his younger brother's voice. The verbal provocation escalated to physical violence. Frustrated, the older brother grabbed Jin, shouting and demanding an immediate answer. Determined to teach a painful lesson through brute force, the aggressor prepared a punch to punish that silent insolence. But the attack was abruptly interrupted. Jin intercepted the blow, holding the opponent's fist with shocking firmness. Fear instantly replaced arrogance on the brother's face. He froze, unable to comprehend how the supposed failure possessed such strength. Jin's aura shifted, revealing his true nature. With an icy and absolute authority, he ordered the aggressor to shut up. Without hesitation, Jin retaliated. He unleashed his suppressed strength in a devastating counterattack that sent his brother flying violently backward. The brother, refusing to accept the humiliation, let anger guide him and delivered a reckless blow against the protagonist. Jin, however, predicted the attack with ease, seeing the opening in the aggressor's guard as if time had slowed down. Instead of retreating, the youth advanced, connecting a precise counterattack that violently interrupted the rival's advance. He channeled a dark energy into his fist, ensuring that the impact was devastating enough to end the fight in a single instant. The hidden power dissipated from his hand as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the invisible trace of the blow. With the threat neutralized, the young Runkandel regained his composure, coldly observing the result of his strength without showing remorse. The commotion attracted the nanny, who froze at the door, stunned to find the aggressors on the ground and Jin standing. One of the brothers lost consciousness immediately, succumbing completely to the unexpected force of the impact. The other, still on the ground, looked up terrified, unable to comprehend how the supposed shame of the family had overpowered him. The woman realized the severity of the injuries, and the initial shock transformed into urgent concern. The conscious brother babbled, questioning reality as fear replaced his former arrogance. Jin remained silent, his impenetrable expression offering no explanation for the sudden shift in power. The physical pain finally hit the fallen boy, who groaned as he realized that his defeat was real and humiliating. Determined to seek professional help for the injured, the nanny announced that she would take them to a doctor immediately. However, Jin intervened with cold authority, forbidding her from calling any outside help at that moment. The young Runkandel ordered them to follow him, guiding the attention away from the immediate chaos. The atmosphere changed, transporting the narrative to a moment marked by incessant and melancholic rain. With a gentle touch on the damp earth, he paid his last respects before a makeshift grave. Jin remained there, motionless in the downpour, mourning a death that, to others, meant nothing. Not far away, those responsible for the cruelty lay unconscious, oblivious to the pain they had caused. Their ignorance of their own evil was the fuel for the silent fury that the protagonist carried. It was then that the family guardian found the scene, trying to understand what had transpired between the children. The warrior questioned the boy's actions, shocked to see the other brothers subdued in that way. Jin's mind, however, revisited the cause of it all. The brothers' sadistic laughter as they took an innocent life on a whim. With an icy gaze, the protagonist declared that the punishment was necessary for them to feel the weight of their atrocities. The child's words carried a maturity and darkness that made the adult hesitate for a moment. There was no fear in Jin's posture, only the absolute certainty of someone who had delivered righteous justice. The guardian tried to rationalize what he saw, desperately searching for the origin of that oppressive force. His combat experience revealed a disturbing truth. The energy used for that feat was unknown. As suspicion grew in the man's mind, the last traces of the forbidden power silently dissipated from the boy's hand. An imposing presence emerged amidst the storm, patiently waiting outside. The family patriarch watched with a sharp gaze, coldly assessing the situation with absolute detachment. Faced with such an oppressive aura, the messenger hesitated, feeling the weight of authority before him. The man then spoke his orders, making it clear that he would not tolerate failures or delays. From inside the castle, Jin watched the activity in the courtyard, aware that time was running out. The boy understood that the servant intended to take news of the incident directly to the clan leader. He recalled his father's overwhelming strength, a warrior capable of crushing any opponent like an insect. However, the young man was not intimidated. He turned his attention back to his own hand. The power of shadows answered his call, flowing smoothly under his control. In this new life, he had the protection and the contract of the god of shadows, Soldaret. The limitations that held him back in the past had disappeared. He was finally able to act. Jin clenched his fist, feeling the dark energy solidify his determination and strength. A calculating calm washed over his face. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. The goal was now clear and inevitable. He needed to confront the source of all that power. The protagonist waited in the darkness, mentally preparing for the decisive encounter with his father. The shocking news echoed through the shadows. The fact that the youngest son had surpassed the twins seemed impossible to many. The veteran knight processed the information, trying to reconcile Jin's reputation for failure with that brutal outcome. The movement immediately attracted the attention of the other members of the lineage, who interrupted their tasks. This was not an isolated incident. A full military force had been summoned, awaiting orders before the guardian beast. She watched the regrouping coldly, calculating the implications of that sudden display of power. Command was on high alert. The heavy atmosphere indicated that a storm was about to break over the family. While some maintained their composure, others could barely hide their excitement at the prospect of chaos. The siblings gathered, exchanging glances that mixed mockery and morbid curiosity about what was to come. With a sharp movement, the order to depart was given, breaking the static of the moment. The destination was set without hesitation. The entire troop headed for the fortress known as Storm Castle. The Runkandel elite marched in unison, a rare sight that inspired fear in anyone who crossed their path. Under the family banner, ignorance of the mission's true purpose did not diminish blind loyalty to the clan. Mary, bored with the mystery, questioned Diffus about the situation, revealing that not even the eldest sister knew the cause. Diffus analyzed the variables logically. He ruled out the twins as the reason, as he knew they would not be at the destination. However, something about this sudden summons piqued his interest. He felt that an important piece of the game had changed. Mary recoiled for a moment, surprised by the sudden change in the atmosphere around her. The patriarch's overwhelming presence filled the room, demanding absolute attention from all those present. Realizing her carelessness in the face of that aura, the young Runkandel immediately apologized to her sister. Luna, however, maintained her unwavering focus, analyzing the situation with the typical coldness of the family. The eldest sister wondered internally if the boy really possessed enough utility to justify such a commotion. Meanwhile, far away, the nanny was dedicated to preparing Jin for the decisive encounter. The protagonist, however, seemed distant, lost in strategic calculations about the approaching confrontation. Jilly gently asked him to turn around, trying to maintain a semblance of normality in the face of the impending tension. As she adjusted the final details of his attire, Jin felt the weight of destiny settle upon his shoulders. The young man needed to discover if the power of shadows would be his only tool for survival, or if he himself would be the key to ensuring the future prosperity of the clan. The great doors opened. Rows of elite knights awaited, forming a corridor of blades and impeccable military discipline. At the end of the hall, Siren Runkandel awaited, emanating an authority that needed no introduction. The heavy silence was broken only by the metallic sound of the armor, increasing the pressure in the air. With a voice that brooked no reply, the patriarch ordered the defeated twins to be brought before him. The patriarch summoned the defeated twins before him. Haytona and Daytona responded promptly, submitting to their father's absolute authority. However, the atmosphere in the hall suddenly changed. The brothers noticed an unusual tension, and confusion took over their faces. The nervousness was palpable, but they tried to disguise it. They exchanged knowing glances and forced smiles, seeking comfort in their own arrogance. Jin, however, perceived the truth. The protagonist sensed an overwhelming and unknown energy emanating from the throne, something far beyond normal. The pressure in the environment intensified. It was a silent warning that the leader's patience had run out. Ignoring the danger, the twins continued to act with disdain, pointing and laughing nervously, trying to maintain a facade of superiority. The observers shook their heads in disapproval. The disappointment with the brothers' immaturity was evident to everyone present. Patriarch Runkandel then broke the silence. With a voice that echoed power, he ordered everyone to engrave that moment in their hearts. Siren's expression became icy. There was no mercy or paternal affection in his gaze, only the severity of an impending judgment. Reality finally hit the twins. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by a paralyzing shock in the face of their father's aura. Jin observed the drastic change. The young man remained attentive, understanding that he was witnessing something much bigger than a simple family reprimand. While fear consumed his brothers, the protagonist remained unwavering, witnessing the weight of the authority that ruled the clan. That man represented the pinnacle of strength in the current era. Siren Runkandel held the legendary title of Genesis Knight, an existence comparable to a demigod. However, such power came at a high price. Upon reaching this divine level, the patriarch lost the ability to feel most human emotions. He became an entity focused on a single goal. His existence was now entirely dedicated to the obsession with the clan's development and supremacy. The patriarch's presence filled the hall, crushing any hope of mercy under the shadow of the sword god. The fear was palpable, manifesting in the cold sweat that ran down the faces of those who knew the price of disappointing the clan leader. Faced with that overwhelming spiritual pressure, the only possible reaction for some was to close their eyes and try to control the panic. But Jin was different. His eyes opened not with fear, but with a sharp and calculating clarity, remembering who he really was. The older brothers, however, could barely disguise the dread they felt, aware that any mistake there would be fatal. Suddenly, the static tension was broken. Someone's unexpected reaction caught the attention of those present, pulling them out of their trance of terror. Jin prostrated himself before the absolute authority of the clan. He knew that this was the decisive moment to change his destiny in this new life. The patriarch observed his youngest son. In his gaze, there was no paternal affection, only the cold evaluation of a warrior measuring the value of a tool. The boy raised his face, holding the gaze of the monster before him. He needed to speak, risking everything on a single diplomatic gamble. The audacity and eloquence of the young Run Candle took the observers by surprise. No one expected such composure from the one considered a failure. The family leader accepted the words with his usual impassivity, ending the moment of tension with a brief acknowledgement. Even at rest, the hand near the sword reminded everyone that he visited that castle not as a father, but as the supreme ruler. With the verdict given, the patriarch's attention seemed ready to turn to other matters, considering the issue of his sons resolved. However, Jin wasn't finished. With a fierce determination, he called for one last chance, refusing to be ignored again. The boy's audacity sparked interest in the shadows. A malicious smile appeared, anticipating the entertainment that this request would bring. One of the sisters found the boy's audacity amusing. The despair of a failure always served as her entertainment. Jin remained motionless in the center of the hall, bearing the weight of the gazes of his entire lineage. He seemed insignificant before the family giants. A murmur of confusion rippled through the ranks of the knights. No one expected the youngest son to break protocol in such a way. The interruption was sudden enough to stop those who were already preparing to leave. Tense silence returned to the environment. The closing ceremony was suspended. Everyone waited to see how the leader would deal with such insolence. The patriarch halted his departure and turned around. His colossal presence blocked the light, focusing all his attention on the child who dared to speak. Jin knelt immediately. It wasn't a gesture of cowardice, but the necessary posture for someone about to make a dangerous bet. His father's shadow completely covered him. The spiritual pressure emitted by the clan's strongest man was suffocating, capable of crushing weak wills. However, the young man kept a clear mind. He didn't show the dread that everyone expected to see in his eyes. A subtle and confident smile appeared on his face. He knew something that no one in that room could even imagine. His memory accessed a secret from another life. He recalled the ancient pact made with an entity that the family itself feared. The feeling of powerlessness from the past was still vivid. He remembered what it was like to feel life slipping through his fingers without being able to do anything. But fate had changed. The power of the shadow god, Soldaret, now resided within him, awaiting only a command. The patriarch expressed his doubt coldly, but Jin felt the atmosphere change. The darkness around him began to stir. A dark energy began to emanate from his own hand. The hidden power finally responded to his call. The energy answered Jin's call, condensing into a tangible and dark form in the palm of his hand. A slight smile appeared on his lips. The young man knew exactly the weight that this power represented for his immediate future. The reaction was instantaneous. Even the composure of the most stoic observer faltered before that impossible revelation. It wasn't just simple magic. A divine and ancestral presence hovered behind the boy, validating his existence and lineage. The patriarch observed the phenomenon, analyzing the situation with a critical eye that sought to judge the true nature of that force. Jin maintained his concentration, allowing the shadow energy to dance freely to prove his point before the clan. That aura resonated with something deep, recalling the same dark energy contained in the family's legendary sword, Barisada. The boy himself seemed momentarily surprised by the docility of that overwhelming power in his control. For the leader of the Run Candle, this transcended individual talent. It was a direct connection to the historical legacy of the house. The young man waited in silence, aware that he had just changed all the rules of the game and the perception of himself. It was the divinity that had accompanied the founder, Lord Tamar, but had remained in absolute silence since the death of the first patriarch. For some unknown reason, the shadow god decided to break centuries of isolation to contact the family through Jin. The patriarch had to admit the reality of the facts. The divine connection that everyone thought was lost had returned where it was least expected. Jin stared at his father, awaiting the verdict that would define whether he would live as a legitimate heir or continue to be an outcast. The leader turned, immersed in complex thoughts. The power structure of the Run Candle house had just suffered a seismic shock. The manifestation of the shadow god confirmed the inevitable. The ancient pact was alive again, linking the boy to an ancestral power. Jin suppressed a triumphant smile. The young man realized that he had manipulated the situation exactly as planned. The patriarch, in turn, was impressed. That was the exact answer he expected to hear from a true Run Candle. Suddenly, the leader's gloved hand moved towards the boy, who had no time to react. The protagonist tensed his body, anticipating a brutal blow or severe punishment. However, the touch was surprisingly light. The heavy hand simply rested on his head in a paternal gesture. It was a rare sign of approval. The father recognized his son's courage in coming to him and claiming his place. Jin stood paralyzed, his heart racing. Never, in any of his lives, did he expect to receive such validation from that man. The family leader observed the child in silence, assessing the latent potential he had just awakened. But the calm was short-lived. The huge man suddenly changed his posture, demanding the absolute truth about the boy's intentions. He questioned the hypocrisy of speaking about family loyalty right after leaving his brothers to fend for themselves in the storm. The young man didn't hesitate. Jin looked into his father's eyes and declared bluntly that he wanted that power only for himself. Silence returned, heavier than before. The patriarch processed the purely selfish ambition he had just heard. The boy felt the pressure of that piercing gaze, aware that his life depended entirely on the leader's next reaction. Satisfied with the demonstrated audacity, the father turned his back. He decided that, from now on, he would observe every step of that new promise. Jin felt the imposing presence behind him. The reality of his return began to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Suddenly, the air seemed to change. The young Run Candle realized that this wasn't just a distant memory. He was physically there. His breath hitched. The shock of being alive again, in his child's body, made his heart race uncontrollably. To test his theory, he focused his will. A dark and familiar flame danced in his palm, proving that his spiritual powers had crossed time with him. The contract with Soldaret, the god of shadows, remained intact. The entity silently watched its contractor, validating the second chance he had been granted. The uncertainty vanished from Jin's eyes. The fear of previous failure was replaced by a cold and absolute clarity. He clenched his fist with determination. He swore to himself that this existence would be the complete opposite of the tragedy he lived before. Storm Castle stood under the rain, no longer as a place of exile, but as the stage where his ascent would begin. His older sister appeared with a radiant smile. She carried an immense object with frightening ease, demonstrating the monstrous power of her lineage. The nanny Jilly received the load with difficulty. The servant could barely balance the weight that the warrior handed over as if it were a feather. Before leaving, the sister left a command disguised as encouragement. She demanded that the youngest get strong quickly, showing a rare affection. She turned to leave, casually commenting on her luggage. Her carefree attitude contrasted with the tension that the family hierarchy usually imposed. Jin watched her leave in silence. He knew that this display of affection was an exception, and that he would need a lot of power to survive what was to come. The tranquility was suddenly shattered. An intense and aggressive light invaded the room, tearing through the dimness of the room. Jilly covered her mouth in shock, and Jin widened his eyes. The source of that overwhelming energy caught both completely off guard. The newly acquired power began to manifest, rooting itself deeply in his being like a new, pulsating heart of magic. Jin felt the energy course through his veins. The sensation was overwhelming, but he smiled, aware that this was the first fundamental step to his rise. He then remembered the legends about the Wind Fury, a formidable figure whose true name was lost to history, but whose legacy remained alive. The challenge imposed by the God of Shadows echoed in his mind. He needed to get stronger quickly to become worthy of the contract he had just made. However, the reality of his child's body demanded maintenance. He settled at the dining table, trying to resume the routine so as not to raise suspicion. Suddenly, an idea occurred to him. He realized that he could use the knowledge from his past life to accelerate his growth. He envisioned the future he wanted to achieve, a destiny where he would master ancestral powers and never be underestimated again. His plans were interrupted by the arrival of the nanny, who served his meal with her usual dedication, oblivious to the boy's internal storm. While the soup cooled, Jin took advantage of the moment of silence to organize his thoughts before acting. His peace, however, ended quickly. His older brothers appeared behind him, bothering him with demands and incessant chatter. They gestured and showed off, trying to intimidate him as they always did, without realizing that their younger brother was no longer the same easy prey. The pair seemed extremely pleased with their own arrogance, agreeing vigorously with the absurd ideas they proposed. Jin saw a perfect opportunity in the situation. With a sly smile, he interrupted their speech and made an unexpected counter-proposal. Soon after, diplomacy gave way to manual labor. The blade of the shovel broke the hard ground, marking the beginning of Jin's plan. Dragged into a clandestine excavation, the brothers complained about the effort and the fear of being discovered, questioning Jin's sanity. The brothers questioned the logic of that arduous task, without understanding the true motives behind Jin's demand. Lonely drops marked the passage of time in the damp darkness of the underground, where secrets awaited. The silence of the place was broken, indicating that the path to the protagonist's goal was finally accessible. Jin's mind traveled to the past, recalling the sealed entity that had changed his destiny in his previous life. He recalled the imposing presence of that ancestral being, the source of the power he desperately needed to recover now. That old memory strengthened his resolve to reclaim the contract with the shadows. Outside, heavy footsteps and the sound of dragging tools announced the end of the forced labor shift. The housekeeper recoiled, startled by the deplorable appearance of the noble figures entering the room. Exhausted and covered in dirt, the brothers aggressively demanded the reward Jin had promised them in exchange for the excavation. The young Runkandel greeted the workers with a sly smile, maintaining his role as a naive child. However, the payment served at the table was much smaller than they had imagined in their greed. Fury grew in the brothers as they realized that their Herculean effort was worth only a few drops of the precious soup. That paltry amount seemed like a deliberate provocation in the face of their hunger and exhaustion. While the others dealt with the disappointment, Jin donned his cloak, ready to check the result of the work. Before the newly opened tunnel, he recognized that, against all odds, the service had been executed perfectly. Jin reached the end of the excavated tunnel. He knew the real obstacle was just ahead. The youth focused his mana, preparing to break through the physical barrier with a spell. With determination, he released the accumulated energy directly against the stone wall. The impact of the magic reverberated through the structure, forcing its way through the solid rock. The surface couldn't withstand the arcane pressure and began to fragment rapidly. A circle of power expanded, destroying the blockage that concealed his objective. The wall crumbled completely, throwing pieces of rubble everywhere. Satisfied, Jin realized that his calculation was correct. The path was finally clear. Before him, the imposing entrance to the legendary Runkandel secret library emerged. The boy looked up, amazed to have finally reached that forbidden place. However, the gate remained closed. He remembered that he needed to recite the activation password. Solemnly, Jin announced his lineage and presence to awaken the ancient mechanism. The security system recognized the authority in his voice and began to unlock the chains. The protagonist waited in silence as the massive door yielded before him. He entered the vast hall, impressed by the magnitude of the secret his family guarded. Upon entering the forbidden room, Jin noticed a motionless figure waiting in the shadows. The man's face seemed to carry the weight of decades of silence and tension. The young run candle, however, moved forward, drawn by an even greater presence in the center of the room. Suddenly, he noticed something that made his warning instinct fire immediately. Before him, a huge containment chamber preserved a mysterious silhouette in suspension. The protagonist was perplexed, trying to process the existence of such a device in that place. The entity inside seemed dormant, but emanated an ancient and formidable energy. Jin quickly concluded that this presence did not belong to an ordinary human being. Hypnotized by the discovery, he reached out, seeking to feel reality through the glass. The boy's mind filled with questions about why the family was hiding such a creature. He felt a tightness in his chest, realizing that he had stumbled upon a dangerous secret. The imprisoned being remained motionless, a living relic of the clan's dark past. Jin felt tiny in the face of the historical magnitude and the power contained there. It had never crossed his mind that the library served as a prison for something like that. The revelation left him stunned, completely changing his understanding of the Runkandel legacy. The mention of secret tomes sparked the young Runkandel's immediate curiosity. He sensed the tension in the air, but the desire for forbidden knowledge outweighed the fear. The protagonist couldn't ignore it. He peeked cautiously, drawn in by the mystery. What he found was overwhelming. There lay martial secrets from all the great families in the world. Fascinated, Jin reached out. Those books represented the power he lacked. He began to read voraciously, absorbing every technique and theory contained within the ancient pages. However, merely reading wouldn't suffice. The boy needed to preserve that knowledge. He prepared his belongings to record everything he could before being discovered. With determination, Jin started copying the content, smiling at his small victory against fate. He decided he would transcribe each secret at the next chance, creating his own arsenal. Those days also held sweet memories. His nanny always brought comfort and affection. However, death came too soon. Her loss marked the end of his sheltered childhood. Later, already alone, the young Runkandel reflected on the past in the quiet of the night. His thoughts were interrupted abruptly. A subtle shift in the atmosphere caught his attention. Jin stood up in full alert, questioning who would dare invade his space. Jin froze upon hearing the sound from the entrance. The young man's heart raced as he realized his intrusion into the library had not gone unnoticed. An overwhelming presence blocked the only exit. The deep voice demanded to know who dared disturb that forbidden sanctuary. The boy found himself paralyzed before that oppressive aura. He knew he was no match for the owner of that voice. The darkness seemed to come alive, watching him like an ancient predator that has just found defenseless prey. Fear locked Jin's muscles. He tried to retreat, but his body simply didn't respond to the command to flee. The intruder sensed the boy's dread. The hostility increased, amused by the little Runkandle's vulnerability. The survival instinct finally screamed louder. Jin spun on his heels and ran desperately, trying to escape the clutches of that beast. However, the escape was futile. The entity's scream echoed through the room, forcing the young man to cower and protect his ears from the deafening noise. The figure seemed offended by the attempted escape. His fury exploded, scolding the boy for trying to turn his back so cowardly. The shadow expanded, filling all the space around and making it clear that there was nowhere to run. Suddenly, the tension in the air dissipated. The entity let out a heavy sigh and crouched down, seeming tired of that dramatic chase. Jin blinked, confused by the abrupt change in behavior. The deadly threat seemed to have given way to an almost human frustration. The young man tried to formulate a respectful question, but was interrupted when the stranger invaded his personal space abruptly. The man pointed an accusing finger at Jin's face. He began to lecture aggressively, demanding immediate explanations about the boy's presence. The stranger's words caught Jin off guard. He realized that the situation, although tense, might not result in his immediate death. The entity searched frantically around, shouting questions about whether the presence it felt was really there. Jin, however, remained serene. He knew exactly what he was about to demonstrate. The intruder's eyes widened, shocked, when he noticed the sudden change in the atmosphere. A deep and ancient energy began to manifest, swirling like a portal to the abyss. The young Runkandel materialized the black flame in his hands. It was unmistakable proof of his pact with the god of shadows. The visitor shuddered, paralyzed. He questioned the reality before his eyes, fearing it was an illusion. In disbelief, he approached to examine the magic up close, needing to confirm the authenticity of that power. The confirmation was overwhelming. The entity's legs gave way, and he collapsed to the ground, crying with emotion and relief. Jin watched the scene tense and confused, disconcerted by the dramatic and unexpected reaction of that powerful being. Silence hung in the room as the stranger remained prostrate at the boy's feet, processing the shock. Regaining some composure, the creature bowed in submission, accepting the hierarchy imposed by the magic. However, shame soon struck him. He blushed violently, mumbling incoherent apologies for his previous behavior. The protagonist stared at the figure before him, finally understanding the true identity of his interlocutor. The shadows around reacted, stretching out like living claws to envelop the surroundings. Amidst the dark vortex, the legendary guardian finally revealed his name, sealing both of their fates. The ancient voice echoed in the darkness, announcing the arrival of Soldere's divine emissary. The presence defined itself, revealing itself not just as an entity, but as an ancient ally. The creature opened its jaws, releasing an energy contained for centuries. He proclaimed his lineage as the last descendant of the primordial creation of shadows. With a sudden and swift movement, the entity fixed its full attention on the small human before it. The pact was sealed with a solemn promise of loyalty and eternal companionship. Jin watched, stunned by the revelation. The immense figure of the dragon dominated the space, awaiting the final answer of its new master. To conclude the ancient ritual, the beast demanded that the contractor pronounce its true name. Jin showed no fear. On the contrary, determination and confidence shone in his eyes. He reached out to the creature and proudly declared his identity as the 13th son of the Runkendels. The story of that being dated back to past eras, when the Black Dragon Murakan ruled those lands as an absolute sovereign. However, his reign ended 1,000 years ago, when he was overcome in combat by the legendary Tamar Runkendel. The young ancestor, however, saw something beyond a simple enemy in the powerful fallen beast. Instead of delivering the final blow, an unlikely alliance was born between the human and the dragon. Tamar emerged from that encounter transformed, becoming the supreme warrior who would define the family's dark legacy. Jin cautiously opened the door, peeking inside the room to check the situation. To his surprise, the entity greeted him casually, offering snacks as if it were a common visit. The ancient being seemed much more interested in savoring human food than in discussing the pact. Jin remained silent, incredulous to see the legendary dragon sprawled on the floor, reading and eating messily. The young man shook his head, feeling exasperated by that absurd distraction involving a cake. Determined to regain focus, he slapped his hand on the book to get his interlocutor's attention. Jin then questioned whether the dragon had truly understood the complexity of what was being discussed. Murakan, however, just laughed and dismissed the boy's doubt with a carefree gesture. The boy hardened his expression and declared that, being a Runkendel, dealing with the impossible was his routine. Upon hearing that statement of identity, Murakan's playful look vanished instantly. Jin sustained the weight of the silence, demonstrating that his determination was not empty arrogance. The shadow dragon turned, sensing a familiar aura that cut across the centuries. He saw in the young man the same essence of Tamar, the first patriarch and his former companion. The sudden comparison with the legendary founder of the house caught Jin completely off guard. Satisfied with what he perceived, Murakan leaned over the boy, accepting that audacity. The revelation hit Jin with full force, instantly changing his perspective on what was possible. Murakan maintained his stern posture, letting the weight of his words settle in the boy's mind. The young Runkendel listened attentively, realizing that conventional rules about magic did not apply there. The dragon began to explain the true nature of the pact, gesturing to emphasize the magnitude of that bond. Suddenly, he grabbed Jin's head, forcing a physical connection to ensure absolute attention. The boy was caught off guard by the invasion of personal space, feeling the overwhelming presence of the entity right behind him. Murakan grinned confidently, preparing to reveal the most crucial secret about the shadow heritage. He described a power that transcended mortal comprehension, something vast and endless. Soldere's essence knew no bounds, stretching through eternity like the universe itself. The logical conclusion was imposed. If the source was infinite, Jin's potential as a contractor would also have no limits. To seal the teaching, Murakami delivered a vigorous slap on the boy's back, almost knocking him over with his raw enthusiasm. Satisfied with his own explanation, the dragon crossed his arms and ordered Jin to release the shadow energy immediately. The protagonist processed the information, feeling the weight of responsibility mixed with the excitement of opportunity. Without hesitating, Jin clenched his fists and accepted the challenge, firmly agreeing to follow the guardian's instructions. Murakami turned his face away, hiding a slight genuine interest as he awaited the demonstration of power. The young Runkandel hesitated at the sudden order, questioning whether he should even release his mana at that moment. Jin sought to understand the purpose of that command before acting blindly. Murakami, however, signaled that there was a second crucial step in that learning process. The protagonist focused his attention, realizing that the theoretical lesson was about to become practical. The dragon explained arrogantly that energy manipulation would be an advanced step, displaying his own power as an unattainable example. To his master's absolute shock, Jin replicated the feat instantly and demanded to move on to the next lesson soon. Murakami recoiled, completely incredulous at the monstrous talent that the boy had just effortlessly demonstrated. The youth maintained the stabilized energy sphere, awaiting the response with a calmness that defied common sense. The god of shadows finally understood that the boy before him was not a novice, but someone with a natural magical affinity. Confidently, Jin molded the energy freely, proving that his mastery over mana was already far beyond the basics. That demonstration of power, however, awakened something ancient in the ground. The shadows began to react to his presence. The darkness gained a life of its own, swallowing the candlelight and distorting the atmosphere of the room. The dark energy spread violently across the library walls, consuming the environment with a voracious hunger. Solderet's ancestral power manifested uncontrollably, dominating the physical structure of the castle. Jin himself was lifted off the ground by the dark mass, caught off guard by the volatility of that force he was trying to command. A surge of sudden energy tore through the air, manifesting with unexpected violence. The spiritual pressure was so intense that the very structure of the environment trembled, reacting to that ancient force. Dense darkness began to plummet from above, filling the void with a suffocating and absolute presence. Solderet's power took over everything, transforming the place into a domain of living shadows. The entity's voice echoed in Jin's mind, revealing that this power would give him total control over the shadows of the world. The young Runkandel absorbed the weight of that promise, realizing the magnitude of the destiny that lay before him. However, the manifestation was not over yet. The entity was preparing to reveal its true face. The shadow condensed into a human form, and Murakami faced the boy with a smile of pure confidence and challenge. Jin froze, stunned to witness the personification of the black dragon right before his eyes. Meanwhile, far away, the silence of a forest was broken by the trail of destruction from a battle. Luna Runkandel remained unyielding before the carcass of a dragon, ignoring the horror of the soldiers around her. Despite the bloody scene, her mind wandered away from the violence, focusing on more mundane concerns. With the colossal weapon still in her hands, she casually asked her subordinates what gift would please her youngest brother.